Well, hello and welcome to the Hey Boomer Show. My name is Wendy Green and I am your host for Hey Boomer. And at Hey Boomer, we are changing the conversation about retirement. Rather than seeing it as an ending, we're seeing it as an opening to an exciting new and vibrant chapter, a time for exploration, self-expression, and fulfillment. And by the way, happy Halloween tomorrow. Are you afraid of the aging of our populations? There are things that governments and societies and businesses will need to address to face the fact that by 2050, 1 in 6 people worldwide will be over 65 years old. I reached out to Bradley Schurman, our guest today, when I read his article that was titled "Too Old to Run: The Case Against Age Limits for Elected Officials." It was lovely to find that Bradley was aware of Hey Boomer and occasionally listened when he had time. But the idea of age being a factor in someone's ability to perform well in business, government, or other areas of society did not sit well with me. I mean, age is just one factor in our ability to be productive. And as the population around the world ages, it does not make sense to me to exclude such a large majority of the population from contributing just because we are over a certain age. As Bradley summed up this article, he said, "Age should not be a proxy for ability or fitness to serve in public office." So we're going to be talking about some of that. We're going to be talking about some of the research that Bradley has done in his book, The Super Age, and how the changing demographics are going to affect all of us in all aspects of our lives, and how many of us may need to look at some of our own biases about aging as we enter the super age. But before I bring him on, I want to tell you about my new favorite online magazine called Crunchy Tales. Crunchy Tales is the first illustrated magazine, and the illustrations will blow you away. They are so much fun. So it's the first illustrated magazine for unconventional late bloomers, founded by lifestyle journalist Michela DiCarlo, who will be a guest in a couple of weeks. Michela is on a mission to reframe midlife as a time of renaissance rather than winding down. It's packed with helpful tips, clever ideas, great advice for today's busy women. Crunchy Tales is designed to inspire and inform. It's the antidote to ageism and boring cliches, the one-stop destination for modern ladies who don't believe in the midlife crisis and want to get the most out of life. So I really do encourage you to sign up for Crunchy Updates and download your free pocket guide on how to age playfully. You can find that at crunchytales.com/join-us. Fun, really, it's fun. Go get it. All right, I want you to meet Bradley, my friend Bradley. Hi.
How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
It is my honor. Bradley Schurman is the author of The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, and he's the founder and CEO of the Democratic strategy firm, which I don't think is called The Super Age anymore, Bradley.
No, we've gone through a brand transformation. We're now known as Human Change.
Of Human Change. Okay. And they help public and private sector organizations navigate disruptive population change and improve organizational resilience. Bradley has written for Newsweek, been quoted by the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, USA Today. He's appeared on NBC News and CBS News and regularly appears as a guest on podcasts, radio, and television shows. And now we are lucky to have him here with us. He has been involved in working with the elder population through Leading Age and with AARP. Bradley holds both an undergraduate and a master's degree in the American University. So it was your article, Bradley, that made me reach out because I wanted to understand the mindsets that were creating all of this concern about this candidate's too old, that's candidate too old. And, we have talked about some of them that are definitely showing signs of aging.
Mhm.
When we talked initially, you gave me some historical perspective, starting back with Reagan.
Sure.
Will you talk through that?
We know when Reagan was in office, he was the oldest president we had ever had. And the population was concerned about him running for a second term. In fact, a lot of the same comments you're hearing about President Biden and former President Trump's fitness to run for office because of their age were levied against President Reagan at the time. And the polls all suggested that Reagan should pull out. Reagan won that election in 1984, securing 49 of the 50 states for the Electoral College. So even though there might be this consternation, at least through polling and perhaps through the media, about an elected person's ability to serve, if people can actually see action, if people can actually trust in what they're doing, they tend to put that aside at the end of the day and elect these folks back to office. That's part of the reason why we have now the oldest Senate by average age in American history. We trust older adults to hold our republic together, despite the concerns that you hear nearly every day in the news.
Well, and it's surprising, because you look at people like us and people that listen to the Hey Boomer show, and, we're in our 70s and don't see ourselves as old. And one of the things that is curious to me is if we don't see ourselves as old, then why do we see some of these other people as old and ineffective?
Yeah, it's always been mind-boggling to me that some of the most ageist folks are people who are older. My grandfather, who was born in 1914, had a neighbor in his nursing home who was born a month prior to him. They lived right across the hall from each other, had relatively similar health outcomes, relatively similar life experiences. Until my grandfather's dying day, he referred to that man as the old guy across the hall, even though they were peers. So there is a disconnect between the way we see ourselves and our own personal abilities versus the way we believe others have and have their potential. It's troubling.
It is troubling. We still hold on to that image that we got from Archie Bunker, right? And
Yeah.
Edith Bunker, right? They were old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and of course we've had popular media and popular culture that have emphasized that point about older adults as persnickety or cranky or out of touch. Essentially, for most of the 20th century, there were one of two types of older characters, if they even showed up in public media or popular media. They were the doting grandparent or the wacky aunt. Like, those were the two types of people that we saw in popular culture. It really wasn't until the 1990s that we started to see a much more fuller picture of later life with the Golden Girls, a long-running television show, one of my favorites, but also movies like Cocoon that started to chip away at this idea of what later life meant and looked like. And we're seeing more of that today, obviously with a program on ABC called The Golden Bachelor, but also in other media as well. And I think this is a sign of change, and change that will continue to come.
So would you describe what the super age is, and then we'll get into its impact on our world?
Sure. We are going through quite possibly the most dramatic and disruptive demographic event in the history of mankind. I can't emphasize that enough. Birth rates have all but collapsed in most of the Western world, falling below replacement rate, which is, for your listeners and your viewers, 2.1 babies on average per woman to maintain the population. We've dropped below that, and we're down about 22% since 2007 or so. At the same time, one of the great success stories of the 20th century is that we extended life, healthy life. So people are living longer than they ever have before. So when these two things come together, they create disruption. The first is a lot fewer children. The second is a lot more older adults. So by the end of this decade, in this country, 1 out of 5 people will be over the age of 65. That's a first. We're also starting to see that there's a great disparity in demographics across the nation already. So there are some states that have already met this super age designation, like the state of Maine, for example, where at least 1 out of 5 people are over the age of 65. But if you go into rural counties, farmland, the heartland, you'll find some places where at least 1 out of 3 people are over the age of 65, mimicking what's happening in Japan, which was the first super age country in the world.
So 1 out of 5 is the definition. 1 out of 5 over age 65 is the definition.
Mm-hmm. That's the starting line for super age.
Okay. And then the problem is that we're not reproducing at the rate that we need to kind of balance
Maintain
it out.
the population.
Maintain it, right? And that we're not adjusting. So people are probably moving out of some of these older communities because there's nothing for them to do there, leaving the older population. So what's happening to that society, and how is government business addressing that?
It's pretty dystopian. And it's a harbinger of things to come for suburban and even urban communities, because demographic change isn't adjusting. The birth rates aren't coming up. They keep going down. And what you find in rural communities is that a slow erosion starts to happen. Typically, it starts with businesses on Main Street closing, or perhaps a school shuttering, or schools merging together. There are places where children are now receiving school in a virtual one-room schoolhouse. Essentially, they've got to do their classes online because the distances are so far between school and where they live. That's the first thing: schools, businesses. The second thing that happens is the healthcare infrastructure starts to erode. So since about 2005, 175 rural hospitals have closed across this country. So hospitals are closing in places with the oldest populations with the most need. To add insult to injury, the caregiving burden then increases for working age adults and for spouses. And we know that the caregiving responsibilities have a detrimental effect on a person's health. Lower immune response, for example, higher rates of depression with this group of this population. They also miss out on making money. They miss out on labor because they have to take time out of their schedule to care for mom and dad, or perhaps a spouse. Then, just to put icing on the cake, we've seen a precipitous collapse of pharmacies across rural America too. So it's a triple threat that's happening there, at least within the healthcare sector right now. And I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to recover from this. Now, this all sounds gloom and doom. I know it's scary, and I know it's pretty dystopian, but at the same time, this opens up a great opportunity for organizations to step in and say, we can solve for these challenges. We can take modern technologies, we can bring in novel thinking, and we can actually modify the way in which rural lives are lived, in large part around healthcare, which is something that is grossly missing.
So I'm curious, you hear all about these country doctors. Are they leaving because the hospitals are leaving too?
Country doctors are old.
Yeah.
In fact,
so we don't have new doctors moving into rural communities.
No, you have none. So you have you had an older population of rural physicians, nurses, etc., and they just have not been replaced. And despite, I think, some real concerted efforts by local governments and local hospitals to incentivize people from urban areas, doctors, physicians, nurses, to move there, they really haven't had a good result. I've had friends who have been in medical school and they were offered 2 or 3 times the salary they would have earned in a New York City, for example, to work in a rural county, and they turned it down because they didn't see a life for themselves there. So money isn't drawing people the way we'd hope.
Now, you suggested opportunities, and you in your book try to pull on historical perspectives of things that have occurred similarly. Is there any parallels to what we're seeing now to what we've seen in the past?
The only other time in history where the global population has actually started to shrink was during the Black Death, the Black Plague. Pretty grim time for the world. There is, though, some opportunity in having a population shrink. I mean, we had 2 billion people on the planet in 1920s. We have 8 billion people today. We grew exponentially over that period of time. So this is almost like a correction in terms of how many people we can actually support on the planet. It could be good for the environment. It could be good for older adults because we could go back to a norm where people are working and engaged for longer periods of time. This whole idea that people retire consistently across the board at 65 is new. It is new. It is less than 100 years old in this country. And when Social Security went into effect in 1935, a lot of people rejected it as an idea, as a concept. Why would I stop working? It's largely believed that prior to Social Security going into effect, people stayed in work, 70% of people over the age of 65, 80% of people over the age of 65. There were a lot fewer of us that were that age, but we were still here. Even in 1950s America, 1 out of 2 men over the age of 65 was in the workforce. But because we had this boom of population, largely driven by the boomers themselves, then by the millennials, labor became really cheap. Going after young labor was what you did as a business. And we slowly began erasing older adults from the workforce. It was the 1990s when that bottomed out, where about 1 out of 8 workers over the age of 65 was in the workforce. That's the lowest it ever was. We've crept up. It's between 20 and 25% today, and it will continue to grow. In fact, the 75 plus are the fastest growing demographic in our workforce today, followed by the 65 plus. So change is afoot. It might not feel like it, but the numbers don't lie. And we have to look at the numbers to see where we're going for the future.
Interesting. But, you hear in the popular culture, you hear the younger generation saying the old people need to move out because they're taking our jobs. There's no room for us to advance. And then you hear on the other side, but there's never going to be Social Security for us because there's not going to be enough people to pay into the Social Security system. So as a futurist, what do you see as some solutions, some possible solutions?
It's a great it's the great paradox, and it's also part of our collective history that younger generations and older generations have a degree of friction between them. Younger people have always wanted to make their stamp on the world, and they are not necessarily as patient as they should be to make that stamp. Now, where do I think the real opportunities are? The biggest one is slowly extending working lives. That is the greatest opportunity at our doorstep right now. The challenge is that all of us grew up in a world which felt like it was never going to stop growing. The fact that we had a quadrupling of the population over 100 years is nothing short of extraordinary. But that is coming to a change. Big economies, China, Russia, Japan, are all depopulating now, meaning that year after year, they're losing population. Russia has lost over 4 million people since 1992. Japan has lost over 3 million people since 2014. And China, which we think is constantly growing, lost about 850,000 people last year.
Now, is this because of death and old age? Or?
It's because deaths outpace births.
Outpace birth.
And you'll
Okay.
find deaths outpacing births in 3/4 of the counties in half the states now. The only reason the United States continues to grow, albeit at a very sluggish pace, is because of immigration.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if we did not have immigration in the United States, robust immigration in the United States, our population would depopulate much faster than it is. We have probably another 20 or 30 years of growth based on all the current models before the country plateaus and begins to depopulate.
So what is business going to do? I mean, they're not going to have the labor. They're not going to be able to finance their Social Security and Medicare and 401ks. And
Yeah,
what are they going to do?
what are we all going to do is the big question, because we've never had to deal with this before. We know that based on projections, the world's population will stop growing in 2086. That's if time, the next 20, 30 years or so. However, business is not adapting itself fast enough to really take the most advantage out of this period. The single greatest thing that businesses can do is engage workers for longer periods of time. That's a great source of labor, a great opportunity in the labor market to grab onto these people and to keep them as active employees, because when people stay actively employed, they also stay active consumers. When we're making money, we spend money. That's just the reality. So we can move from a pretty vicious cycle that we have today, where people are pushed out of work, where they're made redundant, or they choose to leave because of retirement, thinking that it's going to be this great deal, into one where people stay longer. And because the labor markets are tighter now, we certainly have a great opportunity at hand to make some transformation. Think about the labor market differently. Think about why do we have this preconceived notion that 16 to 64 is working age and everyone else is not? That's backwards, and it's contrary to human history. Businesses have made some moves already. They are typically businesses within countries rather, that have a demographic pressure on them, like Germany, for example. Germany made a really great transformation around its labor market, which they're still working on, mind you, to keep workers for longer periods of time. In my book, I talk about BMW as being one of the first companies, the luxury automaker BMW, not known for old people. They typically thought of as a young person's car. But BMW made a massive transformation in their workforce because they realized it was getting older. And if they wanted to continue to stay operationally sound, they needed to engage people for longer periods of time. So they started modifying their physical plant. They started modifying the way they did business. They started reconsidering benefits, what businesses were actually offering to their workers. And then all of a sudden, people stayed longer. Well, wow, guess what happened? The product improved.
Yeah.
And they were able to sell to new customers, older customers, because the ideas that older customers brought to the table, BMW was putting into the cars.
Yeah, and there is a real restructuring with all of the different generations in the workforce now to, be able to mentor both ways.
Mm-hmm.
To the wisdom, the system that we have built, and this is the technology. Y'all need to understand that. So, handled well, I think it can be very productive all the way around.
Yeah.
I'm curious about particularly solo agers. Women in my generation are probably more solo agers than the men because we outlive them. And so, owning a home by yourself, there seems to be, it's not a good, safe place for a long term as far as caregiving as we age.
Yep.
Are you seeing some trends on different ways that society, older women particularly, might be addressing some of those issues?
Yeah. I mean, every situation is going to be unique. There are two prevailing trends right now in living situation. The first is that multi-generational houses are growing. They're becoming much more commonplace. And then, of course, as you say, the rise of solo agers, a pretty significant and steep increase from there. There are a couple things that people can do. The first thing is that you can bond together with your friends into a co-housing type arrangement. That is becoming much more commonplace. There's also this thing called the Village to Village network, which is basically setting up a cooperative arrangement within your community to bring in services and supports as needed as you age. Obviously, there are platforms like Airbnb and the like that allow you to rent out rooms in your house, or maybe if you have an apartment in your house, to travelers that can help increase your income during this period of time. And then, we're starting to see both at the policy level. Of course, it's not consistent across the board, but in places like the Netherlands and Israel, I think in Denver, Colorado, they've set up these co-housing arrangements between students and older adults, where you essentially trade space for services or make a little income off of it. And those have all been very beneficial too. The situation for older women is unique. The situation for older single women is even more unique. Lesser income over the lifetime, and you're going to live longer. So just from the financial preparedness point of view, that's hard. So I think that for those of you who are single and female and in this very active part of your life, look at where you can make those connections now. Don't wait, because this will help build financial resilience for you, and it will help build even to some degree health resilience, because you'll have that support network behind you.
Yeah, I think that's important, Bradley. And I think there are other areas that we, as we age, are having to refigure out how we manage. How do you provide yourself meals if you're, you don't buy a lot of food because it's going to go bad before you eat it. And do you own a car? And, all of those things that our society has become so, this is what we all do.
Right.
It's going to have to adjust and change.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I've done a lot of work in Japan, and there are businesses in Japan. I've seen this in Germany too. They haven't quite caught on here in the States yet, at least at a macro scale. But grocery stores will sell more single serving items now because there are more people living as singles. Now, are you paying more per ounce? Yes, on average, it's more per ounce, but you win because you're not wasting as much.
Right.
And it was across the board. It was really interesting, both in Germany and Japan, how they did this, because it was even for alcohol sales. They even did like airline serving bottles in the store, which I had never seen before. They said, people didn't want to waste a bottle of wine. They wanted just to have a serving. And this is how the retail market, how consumerism adapted to this shift in our population. So there's always going to be opportunity, even with an aging or declining population, to meet the needs of the people that are here. It's just, we have to be a bit more creative now in how we do it. There aren't going to be these hordes of young people like there were in the past. Gen Z is sizably smaller than boomers by about 7 million people.
Yeah, tell me about that, because when we talked, I said, well, I thought the boomers were the largest generation.
They were.
But they're not still.
Not anymore.
So there's more parity, I think you said.
There is greater parity among generations. So about 2 million boomers die every year. That's just part of the deal, right? So boomers are now down to about 68 million in total, making them the fourth largest generation. And the largest one is millennials, followed by Gen X, and then Gen Z, and now the boomers. Well, what a crisis of thinking for boomers. The largest generation for most of their lives is now the smallest generation. And year on year, it will shrink. And what comes with that is, to some degree, diminished appreciation from businesses as consumers, diminished representation in media, and diminished representation in the electorate. We have a very old Congress now, as I highlighted earlier. I think there's going to be quite a bit of change. Young people are surprisingly progressive. 60+% of, on average, of both the millennials and Gen Z vote for progressive candidates. So that will hasten the divide for a bit longer, and then, might turn into a very progressive period in this country. We'll see. But
We'll see.
young people, because of their upbringing, because of the events that they've witnessed in their lifetime, these are the children of 9/11. These are the children of the Great Recession. They are the most diverse generation we've ever had in terms of race and ethnicity. Well, they want change, and they're pushing for it. Interestingly enough, though, despite their diversity, they have a lot of the same characteristics as my grandparents' generation.
Is that right?
We're the greatest generation. Yeah, they're big on savings. They're big on the collective good. They're huge supporters of unions. The fact that we had, UAW has essentially brokered contracts, favorable contracts, in 4 weeks with all three automakers. Wow. I mean, that suggests to me that we are in a very, very different period than we were before COVID, and one that's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah. And so I guess the boomers had a collective mindset, but it also became rather individualistic, more so in Gen X, right?
Yeah. I mean, the individualism of boomers is well documented. Gen X to some degree, but the collectivism swung really around millennials. That's when it really began to swing. And Gen Z, I mean, shocking collectivism in there.
Yeah, I see it with my grandchildren. I love that.
Yeah.
So what do you think we need to do as a generation to advocate for ourselves so that we're not, left behind? Because we, like I said in the opening, we still want to live vibrant, effective, engaged lives.
Yeah, and you should. There should be no barriers to that. We are still dealing with an ageist society, and one that I think is a little less ageist than it was maybe a year ago, certainly 10 years ago, but it still is a prevailing bias. I think we should challenge ageism wherever we see it, but I also think that we should try to stay centered in the zeitgeist. What is culture now? How do we tether to culture? How do we show up in culture? Those things require some individual action. I also think, we place an incredible value on work in our culture, in our society. And when people can stay engaged in work, whether it's paid or unpaid, it doesn't really matter. People see greater value in you as a person. Retirement pulls you out of the game. It literally yanks you from the zeitgeist. And I think it's highly problematic for a generation trying to maintain their relevancy if people walk away from work.
Yeah, and I see that all the time. People suddenly start to feel like they're invisible and they don't know where they can add value anymore when they don't have that title. And a lot of very professional people have a hard time transitioning to unpaid work because it's not as valuable.
Right. Yeah. I think what I think was coming in the next 5 to 10 years is that we'll see more and more companies offer a better off-ramp for people. So today, essentially the model is you're working one day, you're retired the next. I think that we'll see more companies look to give a runway that allows people to slide into retirement, dropping hours over a period of time, dropping them out of work over a period of time, job sharing with younger people, transferring skills and knowledge and expertise. I think that's what the future looks like. It's certainly what the future looks like for an enterprise that understands our demographic change and understands that, yes, you still need to go after these young consumers. No one's saying don't go after them, but there's this whole other group that sits up here that is pretty valuable. And if you're able to capture both during this period of demographic change, you can actually expand your customer base. You can expand your labor base. Like, that's a pretty compelling argument for leaning into demographic change.
Absolutely.
And one business you should take on. I mean, it's not easy to do diversity. It's not easy to do inclusion within workplaces. But time and time again, every study comes to the same conclusion. It benefits the bottom line. Companies make money off of it.
So Josephine says this is validating, and the first time she's hearing about this at work, and it's food for thought. And she does still work, so interesting. And you said DEI. I was going to ask you about that. So you work within companies, and the big thing now is diversity, equity, inclusion. And what about older workers?
You get that response for a lot of companies. What about them? Only about 8% of companies worldwide consider aging or longevity as part of their DEI strategies. It is a really big missed opportunity. Interestingly enough, though, the people that are running these companies are typically older adults. So again, bringing it back to that early point we had about older people being ageist against themselves. Yeah, this is showing up in corporations too. You can have a corporate CEO that's 65, 75, 85 years old. The first place they're going to cut is older workers, and a lot of times that's salary. That's what they're looking at as numbers on a ledger. But they are typically the first ones to go.
Well, there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I think what some companies, I won't say all because that would be ridiculous, but I think what some companies are coming to the realization of is that if they have open and honest conversations with their older employees about what their goals are, what do you want to do when you grow up? I think is a natural question to ask somebody regardless of age. And I think you'll start to get a very clear picture from that about what they want. One of the big mistakes that companies make is they start making assumptions about a person's retirement trajectory. They think, oh, well, Wendy's at 60 years old. I'm making this up. Wendy's 60 years old. She's probably going to be out within the next 5 years. We'll keep her. She does a good job, but we're not going to invest in her anymore. We're not going to give the same levels of training. We're not going to open up the same opportunities for her to grow. Well, that's a big mistake. That's a big mistake. I argue consistently that companies today need to invest as much in the first 5 years of work for their younger employees as they do at the last 5 years of work for their older employees. Like, we want to get the most productive opportunity out of people. And if we let them wither on the vine without getting that growth potential out of them, then they will do just that. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and that makes me think of two different questions. One is the 100-year life.
Yep.
I'm sure you've read that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so they talk about this trajectory of you work for a while, you take some time off, you do some lifelong learning, you study about different cultures, you come back to work, and it's a nice flow of staying engaged and then taking a break and learning new skills and coming back. Mm-hmm. So the loyalty to a company no longer exists. And I think in what you were talking about, investing in the first 5 years and investing in the last 5 years, again, if you're changing companies a lot, where's the loyalty from the employee or from the company to make that work?
So the fundamental change that's happening right now, it hasn't shown up in terms of people staying in a job for longer periods of time yet. But what we're starting to see is what we saw in the 1950s, is that companies are starting to compete for labor now. They're competing with novel benefits. There was a great story, I think it was in the Times this morning, about how vacation days are up. Companies are offering non-monetary benefits, like an extra week of vacation, to their employees to keep them. When you think about the golden era of the American workplace, obviously certain groups were excluded from this, but we think about the 1950s. We think about like everyone had healthcare benefits, everyone had a corporate pension, like all of these things were part of American working life.
Mm-hmm.
Companies, because of the tightness of the labor market, have no choice but to increase salaries and benefits, period. So when they do that, they're moving away from a recruitment stance, which is essentially the way the American workplace has conducted itself since the 1960s, to a retainment stance. So you're not thinking about kind of a constant churn, and this is what they're doing right now. The average turnover for a millennial in the workplace is 2.75 years. I mean, that's crazy.
Right.
They want to enhance the life cycle of their employees now. They need to do that. They need to enhance the life cycle of their employees. So people stay in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, maybe make a career at the same company like people used to do. This is a slow turning ship, though. It's not going to happen overnight. But as businesses are pushed in this direction, and really employees are pushing them in this direction, you'll start to see the change overall. Because honestly, why do people leave jobs? They leave because of money. They leave because of bad managers. Well, if you have a labor shortage, which is essentially what we have now, and you have people competing over labor, all of a sudden you might get good managers. You might get a good salary. You might get great benefits for your employer, which won't prompt you to run around as much to find a company that's going to take care of you.
Well, and I think that in Gen Z, you also have to have matching values.
Yeah.
They're all about having the
They're
values match.
big on values.
Yeah.
It is core to their thinking. I can't say it's always consistent,
Right.
but it is core to their thinking, and companies that have strong ESG platforms, they tend to be more interested in them.
Yeah. Well, we could talk, another hour, Bradley, but I can't. I have to let you go.
It's been wonderful being here.
Such a good conversation. If you want to reach out to Bradley, you can email him at Bradley at behumanchange.com. And the website is also behumanchange.com. If you work for a company that might need some of this kind of awareness, point them to that website, behumanchange.com, and bring Bradley in and help your company, not just him, but help your company do a better job of taking care of their employees. So, okay, let's see. Next week. Oh, okay. First, I want to thank people who are contributing to the Boomer Believer thing. So with the Boomer Believer, that's where you can contribute $25 a month to support what we're doing here at Hey Boomer. And you can get there by going to buymeacoffee.com/HeyBoomer0413. I just got a new Boomer Believer from Gene, and he said, I catch most episodes on YouTube, and I found the varied subject matter covered very meaningful on many fronts. Hey Boomer matters. So that's very sweet of him. It's buymeacoffee.com/HeyBoomer0413. I appreciate your support, and it definitely helps me know that I'm doing the right thing. Also think about Crunchy Tales, that beautiful illustrated magazine for those of us who are dynamic as we move forward. And you can find them at crunchytales.com/join-us. So go and look at their magazine and get their download their playful, how to age playfully. So that's fun. Next week, I'm having actress Penny Peyser on the show. You might know her from some of her early roles in All the President's Men, The In-Laws, or the made-for-TV movie The Girls in the Office. But as often happens to actresses over 50, roles begin to dry up. But Penny has recreated herself as a humorous writer of sonnets, and she has created a one-woman play that's called Sonnets from Suburbia. It's very funny. So join me on Monday, November 6th to meet Penny and explore how humor has helped in her reinvention. And continue to embrace this time of your life with exploration, self-expression, and fulfillment. My name is Wendy Green. Thank you, Bradley.
Thanks, Wendy.
And this has been Hey Boomer.